It is Tuesday, September the 15th, 2020. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, a nation conceived in liberty, the Seminole Wars. Yeah, we're just going to talk a little bit about the Seminole Nation. Circa early 19th century, series of wars they fought against the United States government. Three particularly fascinating and epic members of that nation, and a few thoughts on social justice, liberty, and slavery. But of course, before I get to all of that, just a brief reminder that this show, like all of these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you, patrons who have gone to patreon.com/distantpeasant. Have become recurring donors for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to each and every one of my patrons who are incredibly patient. These episodes take a long time to first conceive of, read about, and then put some words on the page to do, which most people who produce podcasts don't take the time to do, and I absolutely understand why. Not all those podcasts are bad, but I prefer to have a little platform where I can structure my thoughts a little bit better. The real, pure, uncut shit, as you might say. But of course, if you like your shit more cut, more casual, I have been putting in some time at twitch.tv/postpostrevolution, where you can watch me and some other people, notably Kentucky Fried Comrade and Bro Bra, my buddies, just bullshit about the news a lot, play video games, hang out, chat, and just generally be cool and awesome. And so if you just cannot get enough Jeff in Georgia, I will direct you to twitch.tv/postpostrevolution. Thank you so much. On with the show. I'd like to start by pondering a question together, to borrow from a famous speech. What does it mean to be a new nation conceived in liberty? And to start, this question might help us answer the first one. Which came first, liberty or slavery? It's tempting to argue for liberty when humanity as a species was young, that is, before we really got into agriculture and settled villages. All were free. Or at least all were more or less equally unfree. No one owned anyone, for everyone belonged to each other. Nature was vastly more deadly then, and there were far fewer humans around. Only by banding together could humanity hope to survive. The possibility that all humans could die out was very real then, so there were hardly any rulers to speak of beyond the family or tribe's elders. Thus we might say that liberty was the natural state of the first humans, and that therefore liberty predates slavery. However, if all are free, it's not really possible to appreciate the distinction between liberty and slavery. It isn't just that the language isn't there, but that the possibility doesn't exist. We did not live in freedom, we simply lived. Only with the practice of subjugation and enslavement did the idea of liberty come to be. Liberty as a concept has never meant the freedom to do only as one pleases, of course. There is always some work to be done to keep self or family or tribe or nation or global community's material challenges met, or else perish. But we chase this idea of liberty, we ponder it, we try to puzzle out what it would mean to have more freedom, more liberty for more people, to spread the pain of this work around and free people to work at what they'd like to, instead of what they must, and avoid being slaves to the lash, slaves to the wage, or slaves to their bellies, all as near as possible. I will return to liberty in time. Let us discuss nations. Humor me, even if the answer seems obvious to you. What is a nation? Now, we today might speak of nations and countries and states as more or less synonymous terms today, or we might speak of nations as jurisdictions bound by different constitutions or bodies of laws, and none of that is wrong, but it's not the only right way. The character of the angel of the Lord speaks of nations in chapter 22 of Genesis when Abraham offers his son Isaac as sacrifice. And because I so rarely find my Bible learning to be of much use, I employ it here, quote, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing, and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." End quote. Now, angels and ancient Israelites, and even the court of old King James, who made that translation, none were concerned with constitutions or written laws. To speak of nations originally meant to speak of blood. There is the family, your extended family, your clan or your band, your tribe, your nation, all defined up the chain, originally anyway, by blood. Not yet by culture or language or custom or adherence to a constitution, really. Now, obviously, there's some variation in how all this got worked out, particularly in regards to whom one was allowed to marry and have children with, and rules of inheritance. But I find all this worth keeping in mind, particularly when I hear modern language about how strong families make for a strong nation, or the family as the fundamental unit of society. Hopefully you can see where all this has led today quite easily. The idea that heritage, genetics, and eventually skin color define one's national identity and separate us. And it is still widely accepted that it should be that way, as it always has been, by many people. The battle over whether we will be a nation defined by common blood or not, and how to work out whose blood counts and for how much, and who gets to fully join the white American nation, who gets second or third class status, who will form the underclass, who will be excluded altogether and perhaps warred upon, all defined by blood, race, heritage. This is one way to look at the history of the United States. For something like this is what Lincoln had in mind and was going on about at Gettysburg, when he talked about a new nation on this continent, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln was speaking of the Union, but enough of the Union. Because there is another nation conceived in liberty, and while it was never perfectly equal, got a damn sight closer to the proposition than the United States, I'd say, and we're well on the way towards a flourishing, integrated, racially syncretic society in present-day Florida. Which is why, especially beginning in the early 1800s, most of the white settlers of the southern United States wanted it eliminated. The Seminole Nation would not be eliminated. They would fight, they would suffer, and they would get beaten, and nearly all would either be killed or forced to leave Florida, but they survived, and it was only nearly all, for even 40 years of on and off war couldn't bring Uncle Sam an absolute victory. So today I want to tell you just a little bit about this nation conceived in liberty, and about 3 of its members whose stories are each quite epic. 1 shouter, 1 horse, and 1 wildcat. And I want to challenge the idea that because race has divided humanity and is dividing us still, it always will. Right-wingers hold that it ought to be that way. Liberals hold that it ought not, but both tend to hold that it will be that way. Thrilling in the first instance, lamentable in the second, and neither seem very keen on the notion of looking at a person and seeing a person. Race is not so simple, and never has been, and few nations illustrate as well as the Seminole that a nation doesn't need to be based strictly on common genetic heritage at all, or anything like the modern conception of race. To get even more specific, even dividing the peoples of post-Columbian America who came together in Florida based on language groups, while this is better, is still not perfect. For many people who lived together and formed the Seminoles spoke different, if often related, languages. And it only took a single generation for this sort of line to be severed, and this was a time of plenty of generational disruption. We're of course in the middle of a centuries-long process of genocide, wiping out some peoples and decimating populations, whose survivors coalesced and migrated to form new tribal identities. So we begin in Spanish Florida in the year 1710, where their mission system is collapsing, in the face of regular waves of disease, raiders, and slavers, notably from the British colony of Carolina. leaving the north of Florida virtually depopulated, but for the few Spanish themselves. Most of their outposts closed, as with few natives to proselytize to or ally with, there was not much to do. But the Spanish would retain some presence in Florida for many, many more years, and over time new groups moved into these now empty lands, encouraged by the Spanish themselves. To take one example, the Yamasee people moved into the area after conflicts with the British colonies and allied with the Spanish, and many, many Muskogee people, commonly referred to as Creek, also began coming. The Miccosukee people, who spoke Hitchiti and not Muskogee, came too, as did Ahaya, the cowkeeper, leading another of Hitchiti-speaking people into the prairies of North Florida, and there were many, many others I can't get to. But there is one other group of refugees coming to the area to live in these lands who would in time become Seminole, escaped African slaves. Now some simply ran away from the plantations and came into contact with these tribes whom they settled with or near. Others took the Spanish up on their offer. If you could make it to a Spanish post as a slave, you became free, and under the protection of the Spanish Empire, provided you became Catholic and were willing to bear arms to defend the spot you were on. Spain's grip on Florida was pretty light and will grow lighter with time, but those peoples from Africa who don't leave with the Spanish when they evacuate will stay, with the peoples of Florida, and these, along with the blood of Europe, as there were far more sexual relationships between the Spanish and the native population than is commonly assumed, all of these peoples will become Seminole. Which meant there were Seminole Indians, to use the outdated parlance, who had black skin. Now, the word Seminole itself has at least a couple sources as a word that may themselves be related, we're not sure. The Muskegon word Seminole means roughly people who live apart or separate, frontiers people or exiles. And the Spanish word cimarron, roughly meaning wild or outcast, from which the English word maroon comes, which also applied to communities of escaped African slaves. And as I think of the idea of forging a world where shared blood is less important than a shared universal humanity, I think of the word Seminole itself, which has origins in 3 continents, America, Europe, and Africa. But to return to the Seminole with black skin, they generally, though not always, lived in separate communities from the other Seminole, but they shared much as well. Over time, both groups would eat the same types of foods and wear the same types of clothes, as the Africans had knowledge on farming to share with the indigenous peoples, and it was the Africans who really introduced rice to their diets, a staple crop of the southern coast. On the other hand, they, the black ones, practiced a syncretic form of Christianity rather than the Seminole belief in the Great Spirit, and they spoke a different language generally, though even this had advantages for the non-black Seminole. These black Seminole tended to speak a dialect of Gullah, but also frequently English, which made them useful as translators for trade and negotiation. These two groups will also come to intermarry, mostly at high levels of the tribe, to strengthen the two groups' relationships. Yet for all of this, they were and still are often characterized in the sources as the Seminoles' slaves, or at the very least as the Seminoles' blacks or Negroes, always spoken of in the possessive. Did the Seminole practice slavery? Well, it depends on who you ask, though I and others hold with basically no, although kind of, for reasons that will become clear once I actually tell you what the relationship looked like. Now first, some few blacks did live and work among the Seminoles as servants, though remember, these are former slaves or their descendants, and they did not risk disfiguring, torture, or death to flee from bondage into bondage. This was sanctuary. And the vast majority of black Seminole actually lived separately in their own close-by communities, and weren't just allowed to be armed, but encouraged to be armed. A strange state of being for a slave. They elected their own leaders, they built flourishing communities, and they paid an annual tribute to the non-black Seminole in crops, livestock, and hunting and war party service. In return, they received protection and alliance, and really any distinctions between black and non-black Seminole will begin disappearing once things really start popping off in the 40 years of conflict commonly just called the Seminole Wars in the first half of the 19th century. Broadly speaking, it should be clear exactly what I mean when I call this a new nation, conceived in liberty. It was new in the sense that this is where blood, or more specifically heritage, counted for less as a politically organizing principle. Now it certainly still counted, and not least because the white settlers of southern North America cared for it greatly and encouraged this practice among all they dealt with, but this was all new, and progressing towards more integration and inequality, I'd say, not less, at a time when the United States is going in exactly the opposite direction. And by conceived in liberty, I mean that these formerly separate peoples, the descendants of slaves, settlers, and natives alike, they will all live together, and they will forge a new way, bound together first and foremost by a common resistance to the racial caste system, chattel slavery, and the endless hunger for free land of their white colonist neighbors. Conceived in liberty, relatively speaking. Now, a detailed chronological accounting of the Seminoles' political and cultural history along with a military history of their conflicts with the United States government would be a huge undertaking, even for a full-time professional historian, which I am not. So, in order to know them better, I want to tell you about those three men I mentioned earlier, whose stories will all help to illustrate what this nation was like a little bit, how it grew and changed, and what it went through during the U.S.'s efforts to obliterate it. Billy Powell was born in 1804, close to present-day Tallahassee, Alabama, to Polly Coppinger, a woman of Muskogee and Scottish descent, and William Powell, another Scot. The Muskogee peoples tended to use a matrilineal kinship system, meaning Billy was thought to belong more to his mother's peoples than his father's. DNA analysis of his remains has actually been done, and it is certain he had recent ancestors from the Americas, Europe, and Africa all. Anyway, 10 years after Billy Powell was born, his people fought a civil war within their nation that Andrew Jackson used as an excuse to intervene and impose harsh treaty terms. Don't want to get too far afield, but in 1814, within the Muskogee or Creek Nation, as it is still often called, it was divided between acclamation and resistance to white settlement, basically. And it was with those advocating militant resistance to the United States that Billy and his mother were attached, and they went with many other refugees and dissenters to join the Seminole after the war, usually just called the Creek War. As a Seminole, Billy was given a new name, a name more familiar to us probably, Osceola, from Ossie, meaning black drink. This was the super potent caffeine infusion that they drank ceremonially at the time, and Yahola, meaning shout or shouter. Osceola was too young to really take part in what's called the First Seminole War, which is when Andrew Jackson was ordered by Secretary of War and reprehensible piece of shit John C. Calhoun to invade Florida, primarily in my judgment, because of the Seminole, black or not, as well as the maroon communities of the area in the north, and the few Spanish posts themselves. They were all serving as potential rallying points for the black slaves of the plantation economy. Andrew Jackson did plenty of killing of these sorts of people, and either enslaved or re-enslaved many black Seminole and Maroons, before declaring victory and returning home around May 1818. The United States officially took possession of Florida in 1821 and signed a treaty with some of the Seminole in 1823, establishing a reservation in Central Florida for them to move to, which they really did not want to do, but one which at least gave them the better part of Central Florida and promised money, animals, seed, and protection from the Americans, though they also demanded the return of any slaves or other fugitives from the Seminole, and in time will begin demanding the descendants of their so-called property from the tribe. That is, they wanted to re-enslave the black Seminole, regardless of who they were descended from, and the United States won't give up this demand until the Civil War. This is one of the few demands Osceola will oppose to the death. By 1827, most of the Seminole Nation was residing on the reservation. They were allocated in Florida, but Uncle Sam never supported them the way he promised, and hunting and farming the reservation was not really productive enough to support their population. People began leaving the reservation in search of food, and in 1828, Andrew Jackson, their hated enemy, was elected President of the United States. Rather than allocate resources for the Seminole, the Congress fell to debates about whether to move all indigenous peoples, including the Seminole, west of the Mississippi, which they will eventually decide to do. And Osceola grew up into a young man, as all this was happening. He was not born to a chief, but he was a good hunter, a natural leader, smart and brave, and it is why he will become one of the central leaders of Seminole resistance. Under a treaty for which no notes were made at Payne's Landing, the Seminole were to join the Creek Nation in the Arkansas Territory if they found the land acceptable. They were really Creek anyway, it was argued by the United States, which I've hopefully already made clear isn't true. And though some runaway slaves were held by the Seminoles under milder conditions of servitude than the United States, well, starting now, as some of the Seminole do start moving west, their black members, whatever their level of integration, will face the threat of chattel slavery. Most of the chiefs who signed the Treaty of Payne's Landing either claimed they had not signed it, were tricked into signing it, or were bullied into signing it. And 5 of the most important chiefs, including Osceola's chief Micanopy, also known as Crazy Alligator, opposed the treaty. By the way, Micanopy basically just means High Chief, but that is generally how he's referred to in the histories, so I'm going with that. Osceola, according to the story, when shown the Treaty of Payne's Landing and told he and his people would be moved by force if necessary, stabbed it with his knife. I don't know if this is true, but one historian who has seen the original treaty has noted it does have a small triangular hole shaped like the point of a knife in it. Wiley Thompson, Uncle Sam's man on the scene in 1834, well, he had had enough of all this bullshit, and declared those 5 chiefs who had not signed the treaty deposed of their positions, and soon after forbid the sale of guns or ammunition to the Seminole people. It was then Osceola's turn to be sick of this bullshit, and he exploded into a rage, allegedly saying, quote, "The white man shall not make me black. I will make the white man red with blood, and then blacken him in the sun and rain, where the wolf shall smell his bones, and the vulture live upon his flesh," end quote. Now, slaves under the United States, the system, of course, could not carry arms, and in his own way, Osceola will soon prove to Wiley Thompson that if he insists upon his colorism, his color can be changed very quickly. Now, Thompson, as a gesture of friendship to Osceola, gave him a rifle, though after one outburst too many, he will have Osceola locked up for a few days. Now, he was finally released when he promised to abide by the treaty and bring his followers along to Arkansas Territory. And so Osceola forgave the United States its many lives and left Florida peacefully. He lived in Arkansas Territory the rest of his life and got really into fishing. I'm just kidding, can you imagine? Nah, he was fucking with the white man who locked him up, and he had been playing for time for quite some time, since the Americans had revealed themselves to be quite comfortable with lying and cheating. In November of 1835, one chief sold his cattle and prepared to move west of the Mississippi. Osceola found him on the road, killed him, and scattered the money from the cattle sale around the corpse. The next month, he killed Wiley Thompson with the same rifle Wiley Thompson gave him, then joined his chief Micanopy, who was just finishing up their ambush and defeat of over 100 soldiers of the U.S. Army. The Second Seminole War was on, and the United States was already losing. Worse for the United States, the Seminole began raiding nearby plantations in earnest now, for both material wealth and to free slaves, in early 1836. I wasn't aware of this until recently, but some historians hold that this, the Second Seminole War, is actually the United States' greatest slave rebellion in all its history, apart from the rebellion that occurred during the Civil War. And truthfully, I can't really argue against it, given that the entire formation of the Seminole Nation and their black allies of varying levels of integration is more or less the consequence of slaves rebelling, along with other sources of population, of course. But it should be noted now that at this point, this is less about slaves fleeing to join the tribe than the tribe now explicitly freeing slaves. And now that they've all scattered to the winds, metaphorically speaking, and are fighting in the small bands as equals, distinctions between their colors began to matter much less. After all this, for about 10 months, Osceola was unbeatable. But in October of 1837, the Seminole Nation and its allies, though they were giving better than they got, were limited in number. and every casualty for them meant an irreplaceable loss. Osceola sent word that he wanted to talk, and he got word back that talk sounded good. When he showed up to talk under a flag of truce, the Americans arrested him and the 80 or so people with him, and made no excuses for it. Osceola, sick with malaria, tonsillitis, and a broken heart, will die in custody in South Carolina about 3 months later. He was kind enough to allow his portrait to be painted despite being gravely ill in his final days, which is how we have some idea of what he looked like. Even worse than this treachery is the fact that the Americans then pulled the exact same ship on Micanopy that December, after the chief finally agreed to surrender and move, and asked only for time to gather together his people, then scattered across the land fighting a war. I don't know how many exactly, but it seems as though several violations of truce occurred in the Second Seminole War on the American side, who frequently doubted that those arriving under truce to declare they wanted peace and time to induce their peoples to emigrate were telling the truth. Now, for my part, even if that's the case that the Seminoles were fucking with them, justice demands that I reiterate it was the Americans who turned to dirty dealings first and most grievously. Is it really so surprising that the Seminole who were fighting for their very survival and identity might resort to the same? When Osceola, our shouter, was taken, 2 other men were taken with him. One was his childhood friend, a nephew of Micanopy and the wildcat of our story, Coacucci, and the other was our stallion, John Horse, a.k.a. Juan Caballo. These 2 would do much to make the United States' longest and costliest war ever fought in the so-called Indian Wars, the Seminole Wars. For example, at the Battle of Lake Okeechobee, the Americans charged with 1,000 men at 380 Seminoles, and the Americans declared victory, with 26 killed, 112 wounded, the Seminole side suffering 11 dead and 4 wounded and withdrawing from the field. Which gives you a feeling of how the war was going when this constitutes a victory. Coacucci is quoted thusly in the histories, quote, "The whites dealt unjustly by me. I came to them, they deceived me. The land I was upon I loved, my body is made of its sands, the Great Spirit gave me legs to walk over it, hands to aid myself, eyes to see its ponds, rivers, forests, and game, then a head with which I think. The sun, which is warm and bright as my feelings are now, shines to warm forth our crops, and the moon brings back the spirits of our warriors, our fathers, wives, and children. The white man comes, he grows pale and sick. Why can he not live here in peace? I have said I am the enemy to the white man. I could live in peace with him, but they first steal our cattle and horses, cheat us, and take our lands. The white men are as thick as the leaves in the hammock. They come upon us thicker every year. They may shoot us, drive our women and children night and day. They may chain our hands and feet, but the red man's heart is always free." End quote. The other Seminole who was taken, John Horse, was a different color than Osceola and Coacucci. John Horse was Seminole but had black skin. He was the son of an African slave woman and a Native American father, and he was nominally a slave of the Seminole, but as I mentioned before, this, quote, slavery was much less onerous and very different from the United States' model. And in any case, all that was totally broken down now that they were an unsettled people. In addition, in John Horse's case, he was emancipated several times by several different people. Micanopy for his service to the Seminole, and later after his surrender he specifically will receive freedom papers from the U.S. Army, as well as be subject to the general offer of freedom to all the black Seminole that was made, nominally slave or not, on condition of surrender and resettlement west of the Mississippi. We don't know a ton about John Horse's early life, but it does not appear as if his father treated his children as slaves. Born in 1812, John Horse rose to prominence because he had a knack for language, both written and spoken, and developed into a good officer who could coordinate bands of people who didn't always speak the same tongue. He also developed a reputation for courage, cleverness, and marksmanship, meaning that along with his comrade and friend Coacucci, he will outfight the Americans for years. Now I'm getting a little ahead of myself, for you may be wondering how these two men are going to do any of that while imprisoned with Osceola. And the answer is they're not going to be staying in prison. Now, historians aren't totally sure about all the details, but it seems that by fasting for several days, they and a few others were able to just barely squeeze between the around 8 inches of window opening they had to work with. Now, how they dealt with the iron bars that had been in that window opening is not known exactly. They were perhaps weakened by corrosion due to salt in the air, and then attacked with a file smuggled to the prisoners by black laborers at the fort. But in any case, after the bars were gone, it was just a matter of scaling down the side of a sheer wall well enough that the fall didn't kill you or break your legs, and then desperately running away from the fort while starving. All this they did. But I mentioned a couple things before, that the Seminole, no matter how badly they outfought the army, they really couldn't replenish their numbers. Now, this wasn't exactly true, because I also mentioned that they were recruiting slaves from nearby plantations as a source of population. And as General Jessup, who fought some of the war, put it, quote, "The two races, the Negro and the Indian, are rapidly approximating. They are identifying in interests and feelings, and I have ascertained that at the Battle of Wahoo, a Negro, the property of a Florida planter, was one of the most distinguished of the leaders. And I have learned that the depredations committed on the plantations east of the St. Johns were perpetrated by the plantation Negroes, headed by an Indian Negro, John Caesar, since killed, and aided by some 6 or 7 vagabond Indians who had no character among their people as warriors. Should the Indians remain in this territory, the Negroes among them will form a rallying point for runaway Negroes from the adjacent states. And should they remove, the fastnesses of the country would be immediately occupied by Negroes," end quote. In other words, it wasn't just the descendants of slaves and ex-slaves who were helping the Seminoles own the Americans and melt into the marshes. It was the slaves themselves. And as you can see from the quote, they were beginning to appreciate that this racial solidarity was making the war much costlier and bloodier on the American side than it would be otherwise. Now, Jessup is speaking as if Indian and black are separate races, of course, to reiterate that they cannot forcibly relocate one population and not the other, which sort of proves my point, that this unity was an obstacle that needed overcoming from the Army's point of view. And so the Army devised a plot to break it, one that will help John Horse come to the conclusion that their ability to outfight the Army counted for less than they hoped. And as soldiers kept coming and the Seminole kept living in the wilderness and swamps with little more than plunder and their courage to sustain them, it was only a matter of time. The Army offered freedom and resettlement on reservation west of the Mississippi to all, including the black resistors. And this, along with the death of John Horse's first wife, and a growing feeling that the war was unwinnable no matter how much winning he did, well, John Horse surrendered, and subsequently received a second set of papers declaring him free for his services as a translator and scout from the Army. Now, none of the Seminole who went west for resettlement, or indeed of any Indian tribe in so-called Indian Territory, would find life undifficult. But the black Seminole and their maroon allies who went with them found it much more so, as their efforts to set up independent communities and resist enslavement by their Muskogee and white neighbors were stymied, and Uncle Sam would do nothing about it. But for now, John Horse helped bring other Seminole in to accept the inevitable, which he ended up doing for Coacoochee, one of the last Seminole war chiefs still holding on, in 1841. Now, the war in Florida itself would never end in conclusive victory. In my opinion, the Seminole aren't bullshitting when they call themselves unconquered, because though they were reduced down to just a few hundred resistors, they never did give up, and they lived in isolation well into the 20th century after Uncle Sam declared victory and went home. But as for John Horse and Coacoochee, they have at least one more daring feat to perform I want to tell you about. The U.S. government was reconsidering its earlier blanket grant of freedom to people like John Horse and other black Seminole, and the pro-Creek, pro-slavery Seminole factions of the territories demanded that all the black members return to them as property, Not anything like the model the Seminole had practiced previously that was called, quote, slavery, but as chattel. Now, obviously, the prospective chattel resisted this, and many began living in an ad hoc settlement in the shadows of a U.S. Army fort. But once they could play for time no more, John Horse agreed to lead everyone away. But instead of heading to where they were directed to face enslavement, John Horse went looking for an old wildcat. Coahuila speedily joined John Horse after a pact was sealed, and in the dead of night they began to make a mad dash for Texas, with over 100 black people and at least as many non-black Seminole. They would soon be pursued by slavers and the Texas Rangers, pick up about 1,000 people of the Kickapoo Nation on the way, and have to fight a pitched battle with the Comanche, whose territory they were crossing, before finally reaching the river so grand it's just called Rio Grande. They were literally only halfway across the water when their pursuit arrived and began shooting at them, but it was too late. They successfully crossed the river and made contact with officials of the Mexican government, who gave them all land and captaincies in the Mexican army, in return for a pledge to defend the border from raiders in July of 1850. The story of the Seminole Wars and the Seminole Nation, and even Coahuila and John Horse themselves, will go on in Florida and the territories in Mexico all. But for my purposes here and now, that will suffice. Though I want to close by saying I think John Horse in particular deserves far more attention from people. His story was epic. There doesn't seem to exist that much about him in the forms of films or novels or music and the like. I find him far more inspiring and beautiful a subject than many, many others who've gotten like treatment. But I began by speaking of nations and blood and liberty, and it's fair to ask what in God's holy name I'm blathering about, to put it away. Well, what I'm blathering about is that it isn't that blood mattered to the white Americans and not to the Seminole. That isn't right, obviously. Bonds of family and kinship and over time a shared identity as victims of white oppression, all this and more served to bind them together into a people that has genetic roots in 3 continents, I want to reiterate. But the rigid system of white America they did not adopt. And the reason is because they reached a new kind of consciousness, driven by necessity, by their material conditions. The society they forged, a new nation, conceived in liberty and remaining unconquered, even if the land they lived on was swallowed up. That is the power of racial solidarity, for it can make people nearly unbeatable, and it proves that the categories of identity that we are all so familiar with, white and black and American Indian, these are recent inventions, driven by a consciousness also born of desire and circumstance. Banishing these dividers as a tool to sort people into political bodies doesn't mean erasing these differences or pretending they don't exist, because they are very real and material consequences. But as an example, the sort of nation that pays reparations to its non-white citizens for the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow is the sort of nation which has ceased to value whiteness so highly, which has ceased to organize people in politics on the basis of race, the sort of notion in which at least some of those white citizens have successfully imagined themselves as slaves, Africans, or as Seminole warriors, or as gay, or as trans, or as any number of other identities. And they have realized, we must realize that in this way, within us all is every person who has ever lived and ever will live. How the Seminole achieved this unity that I'm talking about, for a time at least, I believe I've already explained. So what about all of us? At the risk of sounding too mystical, I do believe there's a kind of quantum magic to mass consciousness, wherein observation and knowledge of a phenomenon can actually change the outcome. There are endless examples of how that unity has been created in circles big and small throughout human history. The gods above, the king, the nation, the constitution, your ancestors, all of it. But whoever these sortings leave out or subjugate, there always seems to be someone subjugated or left out. Things do not have to be that way. This is not the way most people, or perhaps anyone but me maybe, thinks about or talks about class consciousness. But when I first spoke of liberty, I know that we are all compelled to some degree, lest we suffer or die, by the bonds of material reality, the second noble truth, if you get my drift, and recognize that we all require labor to fulfill our needs, mitigate or alleviate our suffering, make life livable, so that we can enjoy our liberty. True social justice demands that the goal be to spread that effort around as equally as possible, that work, that pain, that labor, and in so doing make the labor less in both quantity and quality for all of humanity, regardless of identity, to work for each other so that we then may work for ourselves. This is both liberty and socialism, and our necessity as a species is greater than the Seminoles. For while humanity has been squabbling about who owns what and how it got to be that way, the planet has been groaning under our weight, while the vultures who know the truth are circling above. In death, all people turn black. Thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that. There was a fair bit of foreign language words in this, so I don't really speak anything other than English, but I really did do my best. I hope nobody is mad at me. Just a reminder to support the show, patreon.com/distantpeasant. There's also a PayPal button, paypal.me/distantpeasant. Look for the little peasant guy, that's me. And maybe more important than all that, make sure you check out twitch.tv/postpostrevolution. We're going to make that a community space for you to engage with us. We can talk, chat, hang out, buy each other's presents, try to stay sane in these worlds, and maybe talk about the news a little bit. Okay, see